Welcome to Property Quorum. As usual, we are gathered by the stalwarts of Property Quorum, and today we're joined by a special guest, Rowan Waller, and of course Silas Dailies. You may have seen him before on the incredible platform that is WiggieWham. Now, before we get any further ado, let me just introduce everybody. Of course, we've got Chris Gilston from Root Home, Juliet Babul of Gallant Cook, Hamish McClay of Search Convey, Silas Dailies of WiggieWham, and of course Rowan Waller of the Property Pen. Now, as is traditional here, I'm going to throw Hamish straight under the bus.
Right, we're briskly away into sort of February, with House of Lords being able to sort of have for its second reading coming through. One of the reforms that is apparently essential, and it is. There's much, as we know, within what's going on with the property sector. There is much reform required, and the renters reform, I'm sure there's much that needs reforming there. However, I, sitting on the outside of things to a certain extent, always have an element of consideration myself for what is going to be the impact of this. Whenever anybody speaks about rent and all the rest of it and to do with property, I think of courts. If anything is going to change, presumably it's going to mean an increase in what's going on in the courts. Have we done anything to remedy that particular sort of one? But more importantly, much has been done over the last couple of years to put a significant amount of pressure on those who are renting out property, on landlords. And there has been a scurry, there has been a large number of landlords that leave the profession. And one of the anxieties I have, are we going to see more of these? Because if there are more landlords leaving, of course, it does mean fewer properties available for rent. But does it actually sort of mean, therefore, there will be more properties on the market for people to buy up? Will there be bargains there? I'm not too sure, but some of the experts here, I'm sure, can lead us in the appropriate direction.
Juliet, good morning.
Morning.
Rental reform. Does that mean there's going to be an increased number of laws on the statute book? Is there going to be a big kerfuffle in the law courts?
But there's going to certainly be a lot more protections for tenants, which, if not legislated correctly, can lead to an abusive process. And that is my concern. There is always this concept of the big bad landlord. But what happens when a tenant really knows the system? They really know, look, I can go into court and ask for a stay on an eviction, and they do it 100 times. I've had tenants, so not just tenants insofar as landlord and tenant, a person renting a property, but we've had borrowers do that to our lenders where we've gone to court, they know the system, and they literally just keep getting stays on their respective evictions. I remember when I first started law, I was in court and someone came in with their children and they said, oh, surely you can't evict us. Yes, we owe loads and loads of rent, but you can't evict us. We've got children. And the judge actually said, look, if I was in your shoes, irrespective of having children, which I empathize about, I would have an eviction order against me because you are in that much rent arrears. So it's a fine line between reform and finding that protection that's required and preventing abuse. And I think that's where sort of Silas and Rowan come in terms of, what do you see in the practical elements of it? Because we just see, if something goes wrong, we've got to serve requisite notices, etc. And we've got to be aware of what these tenants are going to come up with, because most times it's going to be the landlord that you're obviously serving notice on. So it'd be interesting to see from an on the ground view what they expect this reform to, the effect they expect this reform to have.
Silas, welcome. From your end, as you're watching the landscape unfold, do you believe this renters reform is going to be a positive or negative?
I think from what I'm hearing, there's certainly a lot of negatives. From a landlord's perspective, I feel again it's another nail in the coffin towards the small independent landlord who has chosen to maybe get one or two or maybe half a dozen properties to supplement their pension. It is more of a, shall we say, a hobby rather than a main source of income. And actually, if you look at the mechanics of being a landlord, the maths don't really add up unless you factor in the long-term capital growth of the investment. So there's this misnomer around them being greedy landlords. But one of the things I did hear was, let's take, for example, tenants who may have a blemish on their credit file, for example. Maybe they've got a CCJ from a few years ago. It may or may not have been their fault, which is another thing to bear in mind. But they would ordinarily be able to combat that by being able to go to a landlord and say, look, I have got a blemish on my credit file, but to compensate for that, to balance the risk in your favor, here's a couple of months rent in advance, or 2 or 3 or 4 months in a rent in advance, where the landlord could balance the risk and say, okay, I'll take the extra money, and there you go, there's the keys to the property. And that apparently is also now being phased out. That is not something that tenants are allowed to do. Landlords certainly are.
Oh dear. Well, look, we'll pick up with Hamish in just a second, but I want to bring on Chris. Chris, I believe that Hamish made mention at the beginning of the fact that it may be that there's loads of landlords running away. Now, you and I have often discussed this. There's a continuous churn of landlords come in and landlords come out. Is there a particular change now?
I think since 2015, we've seen some substantial changes that successive governments have introduced to really corporatize the landlords and the way that they operate. Right. And it is a move away from where landlords have traditionally roamed, in that they've been, like Silas mentioned, lots of them have a nest egg that's been set aside and into property, and they're very much being pushed into using limited companies, into structures that are overt and really recognisable and taxable by the taxman, but also they're open to much more increased regulation, certainly since 2015.
So are the private landlords now being tried to be made so visible for the taxman, so they know where every ounce of flesh can be carved from?
Yeah, well, remember, most people are honest, so there may be a small amount of people who may choose not to declare their circumstance, and that's their business. But yeah, most people are genuine, honest, upright people, and they do want to do what's right, and that's one of the reasons that you're seeing this mass exodus at the moment, that they're having all these additional obligations that are loaded onto their shoulders, and they're of the frame of mind that actually it's too much. It's actually become a full-time job to be a landlord, and to certainly operate a portfolio at scale. It's substantial. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of manpower. It's not something that you can do easily as a second job. It's a business in itself, and needs to be treated.
But do you think it's becoming onerous to be the hobbyist landlord?
I think it's become almost impossible, certainly with some of the tax obligations that have come in since 2015, and Osborne's government, not his government, but the Chancellor at the time, who brought in these different tax changes that are now impacted. There was a tapered scheme, remember, that really didn't bite landlords until about 2020, 2021 in full. And now you're starting to see the outcome of that, and they're quite a lot of landlords may have been operating these smaller portfolios at a loss for a couple of years and scratching their heads thinking, well, why is it I'm not making any money? And then coming to the conclusion that actually it's probably not in their interest to continue in the same vein, and are looking to exit the market. So in some respects it does free up property, or remove property from the PRS, but it could be someone like me who brings it back into the PRS after acquiring it from these types of landlords who we do try and help.
Excellent. Yes, because you're giving landlords who are stuck in this horrendous trap a kind of a way out, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we can purchase property, we do purchase property all the time from landlords in that position, and help them get decent value for their property, and get rid of the headache.
So if anybody's listening and you are stuck in that position, give Chris a call. He may have a way through. Rowan, a very good welcome to you, sir. Thank you for taking the time out to be here. The Property Pen. What's your opinion about this? With the changes at the moment in rental reform, to quote Hamish, who will be the victors and the victims?
It depends what it looks like when it finally gets through. It becomes an act of parliament rather than a bill. So I sat through 8 hours of the second reading in the Lords, and then the following comments that the Lords made day before yesterday, and I can understand why you see so many funny clips of Lords falling asleep in the House. Because I did nod off a couple of times, but basically, my biggest takeaway was that no one agrees with it. Nobody agrees in the current shape of it. I didn't hear a single Lord go, "This is exactly what we need." Even the ones that were more for it said, "But we still need to. This needs to be looked at, and that needs to be sorted out." There was an awful lot of. I felt like a disproportionate amount of focus on the student market rather than on the general private rented sector market. I thought in that debate. If it was a debate, and that's, I guess, it's a big part of the problem in the private rented sector, but it's not the only problem. So I think that there's going to be a lot of effort to sort out the student let market, and not enough focus given on sorting out the problems that are going to affect the general PRS. But actually, I mean, in terms of some of the kind of the comments that have been made so far, which aren't wrong, by the way, so I don't want to pick holes in them, but there's this sort of worry that landlords are, and they might, I think there will be landlords that leave the market, but I think the landlords that leave the market have already decided this is a big problem and I'm going to get rid. I don't think there's so many that are going, okay, well, we'll wait and see, and then we'll do a proper review, and then we will or we won't. I think they have either decided they're going, or they're going to kind of grumble about it and probably stay in the sector. So there was a survey last year that said that a third of landlords were going to sell their properties last year. And I think there's about 4.5 million buy-to-let properties in this country. And in the end, 168,000 buy-to-lets were sold last year, something like that. And that's about 3%. It's about 3.5% of the total stock, not 33%. And there were 113,000 buy-to-let purchases last year. So the net loss was 55,000 properties. So it's not a small number. But it made up 1.2% of the total, not this third of properties that we're going to see disappear. And now you start to see that there's the figures say a third of landlords might exit in the next 5 years. But I think that that's always the case. Because the whole premise of being a landlord is it's a commercial exercise, and landlords always have half a mind on when they're going to cash in. And I think what I would say is that landlords, most of the landlords I've ever come across, especially not the accidental landlords, but the small portfolio landlords, 1, 2, maybe half a dozen. They're not looking for regular monthly income from it. They're looking for a nest egg. So they're sticking it away. They're hoping that somebody pays off their mortgage over the course of 25 years, and they'll have to pay a little bit of maintenance. But ultimately, they'll have something that's had a capital growth of 40% over that period, and they'll have the mortgage paid off. So the 25% that they've initially put in has only become 100% equity in something that's worth a lot more money when they're ready to retire. And that's typically the kind of the desire of the small landlord, rather than the big portfolio landlords that are looking to draw income from it.
Wow. Silas, I see you nodding along there. What's your thoughts?
It's interesting when you hear the statistics there, and thank you, Rowan, for enlightening me on the numbers side. I would like to understand more around whether it's the larger landlords, i.e. a concentration of power in the hands of the few, shall we say, because there is a suggestion that companies like John Lewis, Lloyds Bank, for example, are absorbing a lot of these properties. So that, to use, I think it was Chris Wood's earlier, the corporatization of the lettings market is kind of where things are going, and it's phasing out that opportunity for the smaller landlords. Is that better in the fullness of time? I'm not sure. I mean, I do know in 2023 there was a 53% drop in buy-to-let lending as a whole, which is a huge drop. Now, whether that has recovered or not, I don't know. I haven't seen the latest statistics, but I do wonder whether that concentration of power, as I say, is coming into the more of the corporate landlords rather than the individuals, and whether that gives people the, shall we say, the customer service of a small landlord going around to fix a leaky toilet on a Sunday afternoon, compared to the way a big bank might handle it. It remains to be seen.
How do we factor all this in with the mass house building we've been promised?
Well, I don't. Has anybody seen any evidence of this yet? Because I keep looking out for the headlines and all these. You would expect headlines around all this new building is starting in certain areas, but I'm yet to see it. And I do talk to a lot of different architects across the country and other builders, and the picture isn't looking quite as rosy as the government would have us believe.
The only house building I've seen is by our next door neighbour's kid with his Legos. Juliet, it appears to me that, as usual, we've been sold a bit of flim-flam. Would you take yourself off mute?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, that is the case. I think Rowan hit the nail on the head. Until this is implemented and you can actually see how it runs, there's no telling, and the problem I have is that the people that are making these bills aren't aware of the situation on the ground. So, you've got the blind leading the blind. It just doesn't work. It never has, and then I go back to the court scenario. You go to court to deal with certain things and the judges are given different, different criteria. So it just doesn't add up. So it's one that you're going to have to wait and watch and see until it gets implemented. We're not going to know what the sort of knock-on effects are, but the statistics are staggering.
Yes, as Rowan, as you said earlier, it just seems to be nobody wants this.
Nobody wants it, and so far, I mean, so last year, so in terms of the money that was £1 in every 14 borrowed pounds last year was spent on buy-to-let property lending. Right. So we still, as a nation, it's still kind of, this is what British people have become used to this as being a worthwhile thing to do with a bit of spare money that you've got, whatever that comes from 25% of your pension drawn down, or from that inheritance that you get, or that property that you decide to keep when you become coupled up with somebody else and you got two together. Well, let's keep that one and rent it out because it's sensible, because we've been educated that it is sensible from 30 years of daytime TV, if nothing else. So
yes, I believe I read recently that in our top 10 of most favorite things to watch is that famous show where people buy things from an auction or houses. Really?
I never made it on. I'm
sorry about that, Rowan.
I think that the trouble. So what it is, it's a sledgehammer to crack a nut. But there is a nut that needs cracking. So I think that nobody's really in the sector saying that we don't need a bit of reform. I think we just need to say, look, we need to just concentrate what we need to reform. Property Mark's doing a lot to wade in and lobby Parliament. I think there were 200 members that had sent letters in. That has all been considered by the Lords, definitely been considered by the Lords, whether the Commons have considered these letters. And generally speaking, I mean, what people want is a better home standard, which is going to come out. I think it's fair enough to protect tenants. What landlords want to know is that they're going to be able to offload properties if they need to. And that's still going to be, in this legislation.
Well, that's a dichotomy, isn't it? If you're renting stuff out and then realize that suddenly you need that house back,
yes,
then the renter's going to come under the cosh, and
well, I mean, this is an argument that people should have homes for life, but the reality is that unless it's being provided by the public sector, you can't guarantee that because life changes for a landlord. Most landlords aren't corporate. I don't know. That's a sweeping statement. I actually don't know if that's true. My impression is that most landlords I've ever dealt with aren't corporate. They're doing something else as their main line of work, and they've got a few properties. And I've only ever dealt with them when they're pretty much.
Rowan, I think the expression you're grasping for is a large proportion of.
Exactly. A large proportion of landlords are not corporate, and therefore they're just. I don't know. Well, you've just broken my chain of thought there, Gareth, in a marvelous way, giving me the appropriate words in my mouth. But what was in my head at the time?
Well, who can tell? Or dares to dream? Hamish, would you care, please, to take us home?
Well, I think it's one of the scenarios we find ourselves in. I like, again, we've had some interesting comparisons, but Rowan's comment there, particularly that sledgehammer to crack a nut. We have a government, and they really do want. I mean, this is something which has come across. They do want to change things. Now, the trouble is with change, it does need to be for the better, to benefit the larger proportion of the population. I would suggest that's what we really want. And unfortunately, again, Silas sort of outlined this particular sort of aspect of it. There isn't a scene. We can't see where this is happening. We can't see properties opening up. We can't see more of them. As Juliet sort of said, we don't have a release within the sort of legal system to help matters through should there be an increase in demand there. And as Chris outlines, which is probably the most positive of all, he is able to help those landlords who do want to make a better way of creating that particular sort of income. So altogether, it's one of those, we're back into the unknown again. I think, to my personal way of thinking, I do believe we're trying to change too much at one point in time. It would be far better to change a fewer items within the whole of the bill rather than trying to do so much at once and create damage like happened with the Building Safety Act, which, of course, as we well know, is going to rumble on for years to come. So hopefully, when it gets back into the House of Commons, those letters will be taken note of. People will understand that these are things that need to change and change the right things rather than trying to push too much through.
As usual, rather tumultuous arguments being tossed around here like confetti in the wind. I'd like to thank the usual suspects, Juliet Babula of Gunner Cook, and of course Chris Golden of Root Home, special guests Silas J. Lees of Wigwam, and of course Mr. Thortus Interruptus, Rowan Waller of the Property Pen. Apologies for that, Rowan. My impetuous getting the better of me. And of course Hamish McClay, whose genius helped me put this thing on in the first place. And to all of you watching, there is good stuff coming. We're just going to fight through this mire to get there. Stay strong. Keep your feet on the ground. Keep reaching for the stars and try and look after that mental health. Until next time, next week, I wish you all a cheery goodbye.